In the icy Montana woods, a single mom and her young son come face to face with the golden eyes of a wild bobcat. But deep in the shadows, they uncover an old battle tank hiding deadly secrets, and their nightmare begins. Can hope be found in the most dangerous places? If you've ever believed in silent guardians, comment where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss another incredible journey. There was something about the chill in the Montana air that made Sarah Whitaker feel both alert and on edge. The trees of the Bitterroot National Forest were washed in gold and copper, their leaves shivering as the wind threaded through their branches. Dawn had barely broken, painting the sky in muted shades of pink. But Sarah and her son Evan were already out, boots crunching on the frost-glazed grass, a battered wheelbarrow bumping along behind them. Life on the outskirts of Missoula had taught Sarah a different kind of discipline from her army days, one built around survival, improvisation, and constant vigilance. Every dollar mattered. This morning, she and Evan were out foraging for scrap metal near the old logging road, eyes scanning for glimmers beneath moss and debris, hoping to turn whatever they found into gas money and groceries. Evan, 10 years old and restless, lagged a few steps behind, more interested in the world beyond the task. He poked at a patch of mushrooms with a stick, lost in a private universe of wonder. Sarah almost smiled. He was so much like his father, curious to a fault. But the smile faded as a familiar anxiety pressed against her chest. Debt collectors had left another message last night. She could almost hear the edge in their voices as she scraped the rust from an ancient saw blade with her glove. A sudden snap of twigs made her freeze. She lifted her head, senses prickling. The forest was rarely silent, but now it felt expectant. Her gaze swept the line of pine and fir trees, searching for movement. That's when she saw her. A flash of brown fur, nearly blending with the underbrush, perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the clearing. The bobcat was breathtaking, sleek and powerful, with brown fur streaked with black spots and a tail tipped in inky black. Her ears flicked, each ending in a sharp tuft, and her golden eyes, sharp, wild, seemed to lock with Sarah's. They regarded each other for a long moment, neither moving. Sarah's breath caught. She knew better than to make a sound. The bobcat, wild and solitary, was an omen, a spirit of the woods, impossible to tame. Evan hadn't noticed. "Mom, look at this," he called, waving a rusted hubcap in the air. The noise broke the spell. The bobcat, Sable, Sarah decided instantly, the name echoing somewhere from an old childhood book, slipped off the rock and vanished into the trees with barely a whisper. Sarah's heart thudded. For a second, she could have sworn the animal wanted her to follow. She shook off the thought and turned back to the hunt. But Evan, always braver than he should be, was already moving toward where Sable had disappeared. "Stay close, Ev," Sarah called, keeping her tone light but her nerves tight as wire. She pushed the wheelbarrow after him, scanning the ground, listening. The woods here had their secrets. She'd felt it since they moved in, but she never expected what they would find today. Evan reached the outcrop first, dropping the hubcap as he peered into a dense thicket. "There's something here, Mom." His voice was edged with excitement, not fear, and that alone made Sarah's pace quicken. Through the brush, beneath tangled vines and a drape of moss, something massive loomed. At first, Sarah thought it was a boulder, split and hunched from centuries of ice and rain. But as the mist shifted, she saw hard angles, rusted metal, a circular hatch, and, her pulse jumped, the faded outline of a star. It wasn't a rock at all. It was an old battle tank, forgotten by the world. A strange, electric thrill ran through her. She reached out, fingertips brushing cold metal where the moss peeled away, uncovering battered U.S. Army markings. A knot twisted in her gut. The M48, hulking and out of place, looked like it had been swallowed by time. Sarah's mind spun with questions. Who had dragged it here, into the deep woods? Why abandon something so dangerous, so heavy with history? She circled the tank, brushing away more moss. Her breath fogged in the air. That's when she saw it. A line of text, hand-etched into the hull, almost obscured by grime. As she read the words, a memory surged, cold and unwanted. She knew this phrase. She had heard it whispered in hushed conversations, scrawled in the margins of classified field reports, back when she wore the uniform. It was a code, a message for those who knew where to look. Evan, meanwhile, was circling the back of the tank. "Mom, there's footprints, big ones." He was right. Muddy depressions led away from the hatch, vanishing into the trees. Sarah crouched to inspect them, her instincts sharpening. Not animal prints, boots, recent too. The forest seemed to press in, air heavy with anticipation. Somewhere nearby, a branch snapped. A deer, maybe, or something else watching from the shadows. Sable, perhaps, or something more dangerous. Sarah straightened, trying to quiet her pounding heart. She glanced at her son, eyes bright with curiosity. He had no idea what they might have just stepped into. Neither did she. But Sarah knew one thing. This wasn't just a scrap hunt anymore. Whatever secrets the tank held, they had found her, and now there was no turning back. As they headed home, the wind picked up, swirling dead leaves in their wake. Behind them, on the outcrop, Sable reappeared, tail flicking, eyes fixed on their retreating forms, a silent witness to the beginning of something neither of them could yet understand. The walk back home from the woods was slower, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Sarah couldn't shake the image of that rusted tank, its secret inscription, the muddied boot prints. Each step brought 1,000 half-formed questions, each heavier than the last. Evan chattered beside her, oblivious to the storm churning in her mind, clutching the hubcap as if it were buried treasure. The chill crept through her jacket, and for the first time in months, Sarah's army instincts screamed louder than her worries about bills and groceries. Back at their battered house, Sarah set the wheelbarrow aside and hustled Evan inside, double-checking the locks as she went. She pressed her forehead against the cold window for a moment, watching the forest's edge. The trees stood silent, hiding their secrets. But she knew, somewhere out there, something had shifted. She waited until Evan was occupied with his battered tablet before slipping outside with a crowbar. The sky had faded to a hard gray, wind rattling the gutters. Sarah moved quickly, boots crunching over brittle grass as she wound her way back to the tank, guided by muscle memory and a growing sense of unease. The tank loomed even more ominous now, shrouded by mist and memory. Sarah circled it again, fingers trailing the hull, searching for weakness. The hatch was jammed with rust, but she threw her weight behind the crowbar, jaw clenched. The metal shrieked in protest before finally giving way, the hatch swinging open with a grinding groan. A cold, musty darkness greeted her. Sarah hesitated only a second before climbing inside, boots scraping against the battered metal. The interior smelled of oil, decay, and old fear. She reached for her phone, thumb trembling as she flicked on the flashlight. On the floor, half concealed beneath a rotted tarp, lay a tightly wrapped bundle of oilcloth and a steel key that glinted even in the weak light. Sarah's hands shook as she unwrapped the oilcloth, heart pounding as if warning her to stop. But curiosity, and something older, a sense of duty, propelled her forward. Inside the bundle was a battered field journal, the cover stained and edges worn soft by years. She flipped it open and scanned the first pages, the familiar looping scrawl sending a chill down her spine. Sergeant Michael Webb. She hadn't seen the name in years, but it was etched into the bones of her memory. Webb had always been a step ahead of everyone, both in loyalty and cunning. If his name was here, it meant trouble. The first entry cut straight to the bone. Webb's words spilled out in terse, desperate lines, a confession, an account of a defense corruption scheme, names she recognized, and others she didn't. There were accusations, warnings, and a promise. I left the final proof where no one would ever find it, unless they already knew where to look. Sarah stared at the pages, her mind spinning. Webb had died under mysterious circumstances back in 2014. Now his secrets had come back from the dead, tucked away in a tank lost to time. The steel key was cold and heavy in her hand, etched with a serial number she didn't recognize. The weight of it all pressed on her. She was no longer just a bystander. By unsealing this journal, by taking the key, she'd crossed an invisible line. There would be no putting it back, no erasing the knowledge now etched in her mind. A wind howled through the trees outside, rattling branches against the tank's hull. Sarah froze, listening. For a moment, she thought she heard something, a branch snapping, a footfall in the brush, but the forest quickly returned to silence, leaving her alone with Webb's secrets and her own rising fear. She stowed the journal and the key deep inside her backpack, making sure the hatch was closed as best she could. Her hands were raw and trembling, nerves stretched taut. She slipped back through the trees, weaving between shadows, heart hammering in her chest as she replayed Webb's confession over and over. At home, Evan was sprawled on the living room floor, lost in some pixelated adventure, utterly unaware that their world had changed. Sarah joined him, forcing her voice to stay calm as she ruffled his hair and promised grilled cheese for dinner. She tried to act normal, to anchor herself in the routine, but every sound outside made her tense. She drew the curtains tight, double-checked the doors, and kept the backpack within arm's reach. That night, as Evan drifted off to sleep, Sarah sat at the kitchen table beneath the harsh light, journal open, scanning every word, every hint. The implications grew darker with each page. Officers paid off, contracts forged, threats made, and lives shattered. She understood the risk. Whoever buried this wanted it forgotten, and if anyone learned, she now had it. Sarah pressed her palms to her eyes, fighting back exhaustion. She thought of Sable, the Bobcat, how she had appeared and vanished, as if watching, as if warning her. Was it paranoia? Or something older, wilder, a part of her that knew she wasn't alone in these woods anymore? Outside, in the blackness, the forest watched and waited. Sarah knew that by picking up Webb's journal and the cold steel key, she had stepped into a dangerous game, one she barely understood. But as she stared at the pages, she also knew there was no turning back. The only way out was through. Days passed, but peace never quite returned to the Whitaker house. Sarah tried to convince herself it was only nerves, that the old tank, the journal, the key, even Sable's sudden appearance, could be explained away by coincidence and the creeping anxiety that came with scraping by on the edge of the world. Yet every shadow seemed a little deeper, every silence a little heavier. At night, she would lie awake and listen to the wind howl through the pines, her mind circling back to Webb's words and the threat that seemed woven between each line. She stashed the journal in a coffee tin at the back of a high cabinet, wrapping the steel key in an old sock and stuffing it deep in the closet, beneath a pile of winter coats. She did it all while Evan was at school, careful not to betray her fear. When he returned, she met him at the bus stop, forced a smile, asked about his day, and walked home with him through the brittle leaves and muddy puddles of early October. She tried to keep things normal, but there was an edge to her that Evan sensed, though he never said anything. Sable, the wild bobcat, began to appear more often. Sometimes at dusk, Sarah would glance out the kitchen window and see the animal sitting at the tree line, golden eyes glowing in the fading light. She would sit there, perfectly still, tail curled around her paws, as if waiting for something, or watching. Once, Sarah stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking beneath her boots, and Sable vanished without a sound, melting back into the shadows. Still, Sarah always felt the presence lingering just out of sight. One evening, as the first hints of frost painted the ground silver, Sarah and Evan sat together on the threadbare sofa, the TV flickering with the sound turned low. Evan dozed off, his head against her shoulder, breath slow and steady. Sarah felt the urge to check the locks again, but forced herself to stay put. She needed to pretend, for his sake, that everything was fine. But her sense of security was a fragile illusion. It shattered a few nights later when she caught movement outside the living room window. It was subtle, just the barest ripple in the darkness beyond the glass. Sarah's breath hitched. She killed the lights and crept to the window, careful not to make a sound. At first, she saw nothing but her own faint reflection in the glass. Then, a shape emerged. A tall figure standing motionless just beyond the fence line, the outline blurred by mist and darkness. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, a silent sentinel watching the house. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker, a local poacher, a prankster. But deep down, she knew this was something else. She reached for her old Army-issued flashlight and kept it beside her on the table, heart pounding as she waited for the figure to move, to disappear, to do anything at all. But after a long moment, the shadow melted back into the trees, leaving only the echo of dread behind. Sarah barely slept that night. She rose before dawn, double-checked every door and window, and tried to convince herself it was only a bad dream. She nearly succeeded, until the next afternoon, when everything escalated. They were driving back from the grocery store, the trunk loaded with discount bread and canned beans, when Sarah noticed the car. A black SUV, windows tinted so dark they seemed to swallow the sunlight, had been trailing them since they left town. At first, she dismissed it. A common enough vehicle in Montana, maybe someone heading home from work. But every turn she took, the SUV followed. When she turned off onto a narrow dirt road, one that only locals ever used, the SUV sped up, closing the distance. Sarah's grip tightened on the wheel. Evan chattered beside her, oblivious to the growing tension. The SUV suddenly surged forward, crowding their rear bumper, headlights flaring in the mirror. Sarah's heart hammered. She slowed, ready to pull over, but the SUV veered to the side, forcing her toward the ditch. For one gut-wrenching moment, she thought they'd be run off the road. Then, just as abruptly, the SUV backed off. It lingered a moment longer, engine rumbling, then sped away in a spray of gravel and dust, vanishing around a curve. Sarah sat frozen, the car idling, her breath shallow and quick. Evan looked up at her, wide-eyed, sensing for the first time that something was very wrong. She got them home in silence, locking the doors behind them. That evening, Sarah kept the lights low and the curtains drawn. Every sound outside made her startle. Every passing car made her heart leap. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the journal in her hands, realizing that her life had just changed forever. Whatever secrets she'd uncovered, someone else wanted them buried. And now, they were watching. As night fell, Sable returned to the tree line, her silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. Sarah watched her through the window, a strange mix of gratitude and fear swelling inside her. The forest and its wild guardian felt less like a threat now, and more like a warning. The world had shifted. The storm was coming, and there was no escaping its path. Sarah barely remembered driving home that afternoon. Even as the sun fell behind the mountains, painting the sky in strips of purple and red, her hands were tight on the steering wheel, mind racing with scenarios and plans. It was muscle memory, survival mode, her thoughts skipping over panic, searching for patterns, answers, and the next safe step. The black SUV's threat echoed long after it had vanished, becoming a shadow that followed her everywhere, never letting her rest. By the time she and Evan were inside, Sarah moved on autopilot. She checked the doors and windows, found herself scanning the perimeter as the dusk thickened into night. The woods, so familiar, now pressed against the glass with silent menace. There was a time she'd drawn comfort from their quiet depth. Now, every branch, every whisper of wind, felt like a warning. She tried to keep things normal for Evan, making a simple dinner, sitting with him as he finished his homework. But her eyes kept darting to the front window. At every noise, a branch knocking the siding, a stray dog barking down the road, her body tensed. Evan, sensitive to her moods, grew quiet. He studied her over the table, chewing his food slowly, worry flickering in his eyes. Sarah wished she could protect him from the uncertainty crawling into their lives, but the world beyond their door was closing in. As darkness deepened, Sarah moved through the house, double-checking locks, pulling curtains tight. The night was unnaturally still. She thought about the journal and the key, hidden but not safe, and the way Webb's confessions had crawled beneath her skin, turning memory into threat. She forced herself to focus on small tasks, folding laundry, checking her phone for messages, but her mind circled back to that SUV, the way it had tried to run them off the road, and the figure that had watched them in the dark. At midnight, Sarah couldn't sleep. She slipped from her bed and crept through the silent house, guided only by the blue glow of her phone. She paused at the living room window, peering out through a sliver in the curtain. The forest edge was just visible beneath the pale light of a crescent moon. A pair of glowing eyes blinked in the underbrush, Sable, patient and still, keeping vigil. The sight brought a strange mix of comfort and unease. For reasons Sarah couldn't explain, she no longer doubted the Bobcat's presence meant something more than chance. As Sarah turned away from the window, she caught sight of a thin strip of light beneath the front door. Her chest tightened. She stepped closer, moving as quietly as she could, her ears straining for sound. The house was silent except for her own breathing. She reached for the baseball bat she kept behind the umbrella stand, heart pounding as she twisted the lock and eased the door open. The porch was empty, but the unmistakable sign of forced entry greeted her. fresh scratches on the wood near the lock, muddy prints on the steps, a faint smell of sweat and earth lingering in the air. Panic surged, but Sarah forced it down, sweeping the porch with her flashlight, searching for more clues. She crept back inside and checked every room, every closet, every shadow. Her belongings were scattered, drawers pulled out, cushions tossed aside, a hasty, frustrated search. Yet, when she checked the kitchen cabinet and the coat closet, the journal and key remained, untouched but exposed. As Sarah stared at the items, relief was quickly replaced by dread. Whoever had broken in hadn't found what they wanted, but they'd been close. Too close. Her gaze fell on something small and unexpected, a ragged scrap of blue cloth caught in the vent beneath the hall closet. She reached for it, her fingers brushing rough fabric. It was torn, stained, and snagged with something thin and sharp, a single tawny hair, unmistakably from sable. She examined the cloth in the harsh kitchen light. Along one edge, barely visible, was a faded logo, a simple triangle encasing the letter M. Sarah's memory flickered back to her army days, to the defense contractors who'd hovered around every operation, always in the shadows. Meridian Defense. The name had haunted headlines for years, whispered in the corridors of power, rumored to have bought politicians, buried evidence, and escaped conviction every time. Her mind raced as she pieced it together. Meridian Defense had been accused of bribery, cover-ups, even orchestrating accidents when their secrets were threatened. Webb's confessions suddenly sharpened in her mind. This wasn't ancient history, it was living danger. And now, Meridian's reach had found her. The night pressed closer, thick and suffocating. Sarah gathered the journal, key, and the scrap of cloth, hiding them deeper, more carefully than before. She checked on Evan, sleeping curled in a cocoon of blankets, his face soft and peaceful. She stood there a long time, fighting the urge to wake him, to run, to vanish into the darkness with only what they could carry. Instead, she made a decision. She would not be hunted. Not again. She'd spent too long letting fear run her life, but the truth was out now, and whatever Meridian wanted, whatever darkness they brought, she would meet it head on. Her training was still in her blood, and her purpose had never felt clearer. Before dawn, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the evidence spread before her, plotting her next move as Sable watched from the edge of the trees, a silent ally, wild and unbroken, poised between two worlds. The war for the truth had come to her door, and Sarah was done running. Sleep never really came for Sarah that night. She watched the pale light of morning crawl across the ceiling, her mind sifting through plans and memories, fear turning to resolve. When the sun finally rose, the world outside seemed unchanged. Chill autumn air, gold leaves, distant cry of a hawk. Yet for Sarah, everything had shifted. No longer could she pretend the threat would pass if she just hid long enough. The darkness was out there, closer every day, and the only way to protect Evan and herself was to bring it into the light. She waited until Evan was busy drawing spaceships at the kitchen table before taking out the battered field journal again. Her hands were steady now. She read the pages more slowly this time, eyes lingering on every detail of Webb's confession, every coded warning, every memory dredged up from the past. Webb hadn't just documented a network of bribes and fraud. He'd recorded locations, names, even specific dates. His fear bled through the paper, but so did his determination. There was something else, something final, something he'd hidden that mattered more than anything else. A line toward the end caught her eye, scrawled in a rushed hand. Final proof secured. If you're reading this, trust only the silo. Abandoned. Bitterroot. No one else. The next few lines were coordinates, partly smudged by water, and a warning. They're watching. Always. Trust the code, not the men. Sarah traced the words with her finger. The silo. She knew the old missile silos out there. Half the county did. Haunted relics from a more dangerous age, now forgotten by almost everyone except scavengers and conspiracy theorists. But if Webb's proof was there, the danger was real and immediate. There was no more running, no more hiding. Not when the men behind Meridian Defense had already come so close to her door. She pressed her palms flat against the table, breath slow and steady. She thought of Evan, still safe in the small circle of morning sunlight, unaware of the storm his mother was preparing to face. She thought of Sable, too, of the way the wild cat never cowered, never hesitated to defend her territory. If Sarah was going to survive, if she was going to give her son any hope of a future free from shadows, she'd have to become just as fierce. Her mind moved through preparations the way it once had during deployments. Checklists, gear, contingency plans, fallback routes. This time, she wasn't leaving anyone behind. She'd bring Evan. There was no other choice. She couldn't risk him alone and unprotected. And if something happened to her, at least she could try to get him to safety. Sarah gathered what she needed. She packed the journal, the steel key, the coordinates scribbled on the back of an old envelope. She filled a rucksack with water, snacks, first aid supplies, and her hunting rifle, cleaning it with ritual precision. She checked her cell for a signal, and then powered it off, suspecting that someone was tracking her movements. Before they left, she took a last walk around the property, her boots squelching in the damp grass. The forest was cool and still, heavy with warning. She caught sight of Sable moving through the undergrowth, silent as a shadow. The cat's eyes met hers, steady, unblinking, as if she already knew what Sarah was planning. When Evan asked where they were going, Sarah kept her answer simple. It's a little adventure, bud. Just you and me like old times. We have to check on something important in the woods. Evan trusted her, nodding solemnly as he packed his favorite flashlight and a battered comic book. He sensed the urgency, but didn't question it. In that moment, Sarah realized how much of his childhood had been shaped by these abrupt departures and new beginnings. They set out at mid-morning, the world still wrapped in thin mist. Sarah moved quickly but cautiously, following deer trails and old fire roads, always alert for signs of pursuit. Sable followed at a distance, sometimes close enough to catch a flash of her fur, other times little more than a rumor in the underbrush. Her presence was both reassurance and reminder of the wild, unpredictable world they were venturing into. As they walked, the forest changed. The trees grew denser, the air colder, the sky narrowing to a ribbon of gray above their heads. Sarah moved with purpose, reading the terrain like a map, following Webb's coordinates until the ground grew uneven and marshy, scattered with broken branches and rotting logs. The silo was exactly where the journal had said, a squat, rust-streaked cylinder half swallowed by weeds and moss, surrounded by a tangle of wire and brush. But it was not abandoned, not truly. Sarah's sharp eyes picked out signs of recent activity, cigarette butts, faint footprints, a fresh scrape on a rusted gate. Her heart thudded. Meridian's people had been here, or maybe still were. She crouched in the brush, whispering instructions to Evan, teaching him the old army tricks for silence and observation. Together, They watched and waited. Sable appeared once more at the edge of the clearing, ears pricked, body low and tense. Sarah knew the choice was made. There would be no more running, no more hiding. She would go on the offensive, find the evidence, and force the truth into the open, no matter what waited for her in the shadows. Rain began to fall as Sarah led Evan deeper into the Bitterroot woods. The first drops pattering softly against the canopy and soon becoming a steady, drumming rhythm. It soaked through the branches, turning the undergrowth slick and treacherous, dampening every sound, but making the world seem closer, tighter, as if even the forest itself was holding its breath. Sarah's boots sank into the mossy earth, each step deliberate and silent. Her old army training guided her, head low, eyes constantly moving, every sense tuned for danger. Evan kept pace behind her, small but resilient, never complaining as mud splattered his jeans and icy water trickled down his collar. He glanced often at Sable, who wove through the brush with effortless grace, stopping every so often to scan the shadows, ears swiveling at noises Sarah couldn't hear. The wildcat's presence was a comfort and a warning. If Sable grew anxious, so did Sarah. There were moments when Sable froze, every muscle taut, nose twitching, golden eyes narrowing at some unseen movement beyond the veil of rain. Sarah would pause too, clutching the rifle tighter, listening for footsteps that might not belong to deer or fox. They moved slowly, crossing streams swollen with autumn rain, clambering over fallen logs, weaving through stands of lodgepole pine. Time blurred, measured only by the steady drumming of the rain and the growing fatigue in Sarah's legs. The air grew colder as they climbed higher, their breath turning to mist. Evan's cheeks were pink, his hair slicked to his forehead, but he pressed on, driven by his mother's determination and the silent, strange comfort of Sable's company. At last, the forest thinned and the ground leveled out, revealing the broken spine of a forgotten road, half buried beneath leaves and grass. At its end stood the missile silo, a hulking, cylindrical relic of concrete and rusted steel, its entrance choked by thorny brambles and the skeletal remains of a chain-link fence. It looked like a scar in the earth, forbidding and out of place. Sarah's heart thudded at the sight. She knew the real challenge waited here. Drawing closer, Sarah spotted the signs of intrusion she'd feared. Lengths of wire twisted along the ground, the subtle gleam of glass from broken sensors, an unnatural pattern to the debris. Human hands had been here, and recently. She stopped Evan with a gesture, scanning the perimeter, piecing together the threats. Someone had set up motion sensors, perhaps more. She remembered stories from Webb's journal, mechanical traps, designed to keep the wrong people out, or worse, to delay the right ones just long enough for backup to arrive. The rain made it harder to see, to hear, to judge distance. Sarah moved carefully, eyes tracing wires along the ground, looking for patterns, disturbed earth, the gleam of a tripwire in the grass. She led Evan in a wide arc, testing every step, whispering quick instructions when needed. Sable watched from the shadows, perfectly still, as if weighing the risks herself. A sudden snap underfoot made Sarah freeze. Evan had dropped his flashlight, its beam slicing through the mist and landing directly on a patch of wire ahead. The light caught on something metallic, and for a moment, time slowed. Sarah's heart pounded as she reached out and grabbed the flashlight, flipping it off, her ears straining for any response. For a moment, all she could hear was the relentless rain. Then, from beyond the silo, a shape emerged from the mist. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a dark poncho. The figure moved with confidence, boots crunching on gravel, head turning as if listening for trouble. Sarah yanked Evan into the brush, pressing him close, her breath held tight. Sable crouched nearby, body low, tail flicking in agitation. The guards' eyes swept the area, passing over their hiding place, lingering for a heartbeat before moving on. Sarah felt sweat bead on her skin despite the cold. She counted slow seconds, willing her heart to calm, willing Evan to stay still. She knew there would be more than one guard, likely 2 or 3 watching the approaches, waiting for someone foolish or desperate enough to try their luck. Webb's warnings echoed in her mind, blending with the instincts honed over years. Patience, silence, study the rhythm of the enemy. They watched as the guard disappeared behind the silo, the crunch of his footsteps fading into the storm. Sarah exhaled slowly, calculating her next move. The way in was blocked by more than rain and time. She would have to find another way, a weakness in the perimeter, a moment when the guard's attention lapsed. She whispered to Evan, pointing out the tripwires, explaining how to stay low, how to breathe, how to trust his own senses. Sable suddenly darted forward, silent and swift, drawing the attention of a second guard who shouted and gave chase, crashing through the underbrush. It was the chance Sarah needed. She pulled Evan behind her, slipping through the gap Sable had opened, heart hammering as they dashed to the silo's side entrance. The steel key from Webb's journal fit the lock with a satisfying click. The door swung open, and they slipped inside, swallowed by the darkness and the lingering smell of oil and old secrets. Inside, Sarah crouched with Evan, rifle ready, every sense electric. They had made it past the first barrier, but she knew the hardest part still waited in the dark below. Somewhere in the gloom, Webb's final proof was hidden. The truth was close, if they could reach it before Meridian's people closed in. Outside, rain beat down in relentless sheets, washing away their tracks, but not their danger. The heart of the forest held its breath, as if waiting for what would come next. The heavy steel door groaned shut behind Sarah and Evan, sealing them in the cold, echoing dark of the missile silo. For a moment, all sound was swallowed, but the thundering of Sarah's own heart and the steady, quiet breaths of her son at her side. She fumbled for her flashlight, hands slick with rain and adrenaline, and snapped the beam on, painting trembling arcs across ancient concrete, corroded pipes, and half-collapsed stairways that spiraled downward into the earth. She led Evan with gentle pressure, boots finding their way along metal grates slick with decades of condensation. Above, muffled shouts rang out, guards calling to each other, the chaos triggered by Sable's wild charge. The Bobcat's screeches echoed for a second, then faded, replaced by frantic footsteps and the distant clatter of gear. Sable had given them their chance, and Sarah moved quickly, weaving through shadows, hugging the walls. The air grew colder as they descended, heavy with the scent of rust, oil, and mildew. Water dripped steadily, landing in pools that rippled with every vibration. Sarah's light landed on graffiti scrawled in faded paint, ghosts of other trespassers, messages of fear and defiance. She ignored them, focusing on Webb's directions from the journal, her memory replaying the details. 2 flights down, 3rd hatch on the right, storage bay marked with a faded red X. They reached the 2nd level, pausing to listen. The sounds above faded. Either the guards were chasing Sable deeper into the woods or regrouping, unsure if anyone had actually breached the silo. Sarah hoped for the latter, knowing it would buy them precious time. She found the hatch Webb described, nearly hidden behind a pile of rusted barrels and tangled netting. With trembling fingers, she slid the steel key into the lock. It turned with a reluctant click. The hatch yawned open, revealing a cramped storage bay lit only by Sarah's flashlight. The air inside was thick with dust. On a battered metal shelf lay a waterproof duffel bag, its zipper taped and sealed, and beside it, a bundle of audio cassettes, a battered disposable camera, and a folder thick with papers. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled the evidence free, stuffing the folder and cassettes into her pack. The camera rattled in her palm. She flipped it over, finding fresh tape securing the film door. Webb had left nothing to chance. Every item was labeled, every detail logged. Contracts, payoffs, photographs of men in suits exchanging briefcases in dimly lit rooms, recordings of whispered conversations, names, numbers, codes. It was enough. It had to be. Sarah zipped the bag shut just as voices boomed down the stairwell, echoing off the walls. Flashlight beams swept the level above. The guards had regrouped, and now they knew someone was inside. There was no time to linger, no time for hesitation. Sarah slung her pack over one shoulder and drew Evan close, guiding him with a whispered promise that they were almost through, almost safe. She led him away from the storage bay, ducking through a side corridor lined with fuse boxes and old wiring. Her army training took over, every turn calculated, every shadow a potential threat. At each junction she paused, ears straining for the approach of boots, for the metallic click of a weapon, for the telltale rhythm of pursuit. Near the main exit, her luck ran out. A guard appeared, blocking the way, tall, face obscured by a black balaclava, gun raised. For a heartbeat, time froze. Sarah shoved Evan behind a crate, heart pounding, instincts screaming. The guard advanced, gunlight sweeping the shadows, voice harsh and cold. Sarah stayed low, calculating distance and angles, pulse racing with adrenaline and memory. Suddenly, from the darkness behind the guard, Sable exploded into view, fur bristling, teeth bared, claws raking the concrete. The man swung his weapon, startled, but Sable was faster. She darted past, a blur of wild muscle and fury, drawing the guard's fire away from Sarah and Evan. In that instant, Sarah moved, springing from cover, knocking the weapon aside, using every ounce of training and desperation to neutralize the threat. The guard went down hard, groaning, gun skittering across the floor. Sarah didn't wait. She grabbed Evan, urging him toward the exit, feet pounding on the grates as alarms blared, and the entire silo erupted into chaos. Behind them, more voices shouted, boots thundered, flashlights cut jagged paths through the gloom. Sarah raced up the final flight of stairs, lungs burning, mind fixed on the only goal that mattered. Get Evan out, get the evidence out, survive. At the top, the exit was blocked. Standing in the rain-soaked doorway, framed by lightning and the swirling storm, was Helena Cross, Meridian Defense's CEO. Her hair slicked back, eyes cold and calculating. She was flanked by two more guards, each armed and ready. For a moment, everything stopped. The storm, the shouting, the pounding of Sarah's heart. She met Helena's gaze, the unspoken challenge sharp as a knife. Then, using the cover of rain and confusion, Sarah acted. She ducked low, shoving Evan ahead, weaving through the maze of bodies, trusting the chaos and her own instincts to carry them through. The world became a blur of rain, mud, shouts, and gunfire. She felt hands grabbing, heard curses and threats, but kept moving, never letting go of Evan's hand. Finally, the woods opened before them. Sable reappeared at their side, wild and triumphant, as Sarah and Evan crashed through the trees, sprinting for cover. They didn't stop until the silo was only a distant echo, and the darkness of the forest had swallowed the last sounds of pursuit. They had the evidence. They had each other. And for the first time, Sarah believed they might actually have a chance. The escape through the woods was a fevered blur. Sarah moved with adrenaline and muscle memory, feet slipping over roots slick with rain, lungs burning with the cold night air. She held tight to Evan's hand, guiding him through tangles of ferns and fallen branches, always listening for voices or gunshots behind them. Sable melted in and out of sight, sometimes leading, sometimes flanking, her wild presence both shield and shadow as they fled deeper into the Bitterroot. Sarah pushed them onward long after her body screamed for rest, stopping only when the shouts and flashlights faded into nothing and the relentless rain muffled every trace of their passage. When at last she risked a halt, Sarah found a narrow ravine choked with ferns and fallen logs, hidden beneath the dense canopy. There, breath ragged, she crouched with Evan beneath the low branches and pressed him close, feeling the fast flutter of his heart through soaked layers of clothing. She whispered soft words, reassurance more for herself than for him, and scanned the darkness, senses stretched thin. Minutes bled into hours. Rain dripped through the leaves in an endless cold rhythm. When it seemed safe, Sarah peeled off her soaked jacket and wrapped it around Evan, then checked the evidence in her pack, hands trembling with both fatigue and anticipation. Webb's duffel, the cassettes, the photos, the files, all accounted for. She checked her phone, keeping it off except for a few brief, desperate attempts to catch a signal. Nothing. She would have to find higher ground and daylight, but not yet. Not until she was sure Meridian's people had given up the chase. When dawn finally crept into the woods, Sarah found a thin gray light that revealed just how far they'd run. Both she and Evan were streaked with mud and bramble scratches, shoes soaked through. Her muscles ached, but the relief of survival was sharper than any pain. She urged Evan to eat a granola bar from her pack, then led him toward the edge of the forest, skirting old logging roads and always keeping the silo at their backs. They reached the outskirts of town by midday, hiding in the shadows of abandoned outbuildings. Sarah's mind ran through every step of her next move. Her military contacts, encrypted emails, the old friend in D.C. who owed her a favor and who, she hoped, would recognize the urgency when she sent him everything. She ducked into a disused barn and set to work, using a battered laptop she'd stashed for emergencies, burning through stolen Wi-Fi to transmit every document, every photo, every audio recording. With each file uploaded, she felt the noose around them loosen a little more. The process took hours, punctuated by the constant gnawing fear that Meridian's people would find them before she finished. Evan dozed in the straw beside her, Sable keeping a wary watch from a broken window. The Bobcat's tail flicked, eyes narrowed, as if daring any threat to approach. When the last file sent, Sarah wrote a terse, coded message. Location secure, all evidence attached, need immediate extraction for civilian and minor. Priority, maximum threat. She hit send and destroyed the laptop, smashing the hard drive and scattering the pieces in the mud outside. She pocketed the phone and waited. Evening brought the distant sound of helicopters, first one, then two, sweeping the treetops with searchlights. For a moment, Sarah's gut twisted, certain Meridian had come. But as she crept to the edge of the barn, she saw uniforms that brought a wave of bitter relief. Not private security, but U.S. military. Her contact had come through. Within an hour, federal agents and loyal soldiers fanned out across the area, securing the silo, detaining Helena Cross and her men, and gathering every scrap of evidence Sarah had risked her life to collect. Sarah and Evan were driven home in silence, past the splintered trees and muddy roads that marked their escape. But home was not as they had left it. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, every window smashed, furniture overturned and broken. The kitchen was a ruin, the bedrooms ransacked. Spray paint scarred the walls, slurs, threats, warnings. The violence of Meridian's retribution was plain, the message unmistakable. No one crosses us and walks away unchanged. Standing in the debris, Sarah felt the exhaustion settle into her bones. For a moment, she let herself grieve the home she'd tried so hard to build, the peace she'd fought to maintain. But the weight of what she'd accomplished was heavier still. She held Evan, promising that they would start again, somewhere new, somewhere safe. At dusk, with the authorities gone and the town settling into uneasy quiet, Sarah stepped outside to the edge of the woods. Sable was there, sitting tall and silent at the tree line, golden eyes reflecting the last light of day. The bobcat regarded her for a long moment, a wild guardian, unknowable and unafraid. Then, with a final flick of her tail, Sable vanished into the shadows, her role in their story finished. Sarah watched until the forest swallowed every trace of her. In the aftermath, Sarah understood what she had gained and what she had lost. The cost of truth was measured not just in bruises and broken doors, but in the knowledge that some wars leave scars no one else can see. Still, she would not trade the choice she'd made. She had protected her son, exposed the corrupt, and found courage she'd thought long buried. The world was not safe, but she and Evan were still standing, and that was enough. The weeks that followed were quiet, almost eerily so. For the first time in months, Sarah woke without her body braced for alarm, the old rhythm of tension gradually dissolving into the gentler routines of daily life. The authorities offered her a small compensation package, barely enough to cover their immediate losses, but it was something. With what little they had salvaged, Sarah found them a modest rental house on the edge of Missoula, far from the ruined home where so much had unraveled. Their new place was nothing special. A squat bungalow with peeling blue paint, a patchy yard, and a single stubborn pine tree that rattled against Evan's window in the wind. But it was clean, and most important, safe. The landlord was a Vietnam vet who lived 2 doors down and didn't ask questions. Sarah paid the deposit in cash, nodded at his silent understanding, and set about making the house their own. Day by day, they fell into a pattern. Evan enrolled in the local elementary school and quickly found his place among the other kids, drawn by his quiet courage and an affinity for sketching wild animals in the margins of his notebooks. Sarah picked up work wherever she could. Odd jobs, some bookkeeping for a construction crew, part-time shifts at a diner in town. There were still long nights and short paychecks, but the shadow that had chased them was gone. At home, Sarah let herself rest in ways she hadn't allowed for years. The little house became a fortress of simplicity. Hand-me-down furniture, cheap curtains, the kettle always on for cocoa. She hung blankets over the windows at first, flinching at every car door or creak outside. But as days stretched into weeks and nothing happened, she let herself breathe again. The nightmares faded. In their place came dreams of quiet forests and Sable's gold eyes watching from the shadows, always present, always protective. Evan claimed the corner bedroom with the wide window overlooking the pine. One Saturday morning, As Sarah unpacked boxes in the kitchen, Evan taped a photo to his window, a printed image of Sable copied from a wildlife magazine, the caption trimmed away. He said nothing, but Sarah understood. The Bobcat was more than a memory. She was a symbol of what they'd survived, a guardian spirit woven into their family's story. Sometimes, when Sarah passed Evan's room at night, she would see him sitting by the window, staring out into the dark as if hoping for a flicker of movement beneath the trees. The scars of the past remained, faint but unyielding. Sarah found herself replaying old patterns, double-checking locks, jumping at strange noises. But over time, the grip of those habits loosened. She began to trust again, if only a little. She volunteered at Evan's school, swapped stories with other parents, shared wary laughter over burnt coffee in the break room. There were moments when she caught herself smiling and realized how long it had been since it felt real. Sometimes, though, the weight of what she'd done, what she'd risked, would return in the stillness of the night. Sarah would sit at the small kitchen table sipping tea, the world outside silent except for the distant hum of traffic. She would think about Webb's journal, about the men and women whose lives had been changed, some destroyed by the corruption she'd helped expose. She wondered if justice, in the end, could ever balance the scale. Still, she knew she had done what was right, even as the cost lingered in unexpected ways. As autumn turned to winter, Sarah and Evan settled further into their new life. The first snowfall covered the yard in a hush, the world remade in white. They decorated the windows with paper cutouts, baked cookies that came out burnt on the edges, and invited their new neighbors for coffee and pie. In these small acts, Sarah found healing, a slow mending that came not from forgetting, but from forging new memories over the scars. One evening, as dusk fell and the pine tree tossed in the wind, Sarah joined Evan at his window. Together, they watched as shadows stretched across the yard, the world outside cloaked in quiet. Evan pointed at the photo of Sable and smiled, a private, secret kind of smile. Sarah squeezed his shoulder, gratitude rising in her chest. Justice, she realized, was not always about punishment or vengeance. Sometimes it was about choosing to live, to rebuild, to protect what mattered most, no matter what had been lost. In their new home, with the past behind them and the wild promise of the future ahead, Sarah and Evan found peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of survival, of lessons learned, of loving fiercely in the aftermath of fear. The world was never truly safe, but it was theirs again. And as long as they remembered the silent guardians at the edge of the woods, they would never face it alone. Months rolled by, and with them the sharpest edges of Sarah's memories dulled into something she could carry. The legal storm that followed their escape from the silo played out mostly in headlines and in curt official calls that Sarah received but never initiated. The military, her old Pentagon contact, and the federal agents all expressed their gratitude. And eventually, the world moved on to the next outrage, the next secret revealed. Yet Sarah's life had shifted irrevocably. She was no longer just a survivor of danger. She was now a guardian in her own right, of the fragile, necessary trust that holds a family together after the world has tried to take everything. She found herself thinking often about Sable. The wild bobcat's presence had always been both comfort and challenge, a living reminder that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits in silence and shadow. On quiet afternoons, Sarah would take long walks along the edge of the woods, boots crunching on frost-bitten leaves, half hoping to catch a glimpse of golden eyes watching her from the brush. But Sable had moved on, her work finished, her wildness once again belonging only to the forest. Sarah was changed too. There was a new weight in her, but also a steadiness, a resolve that wasn't just muscle and reflex, but born of choice. She had faced down the worst parts of human nature and hadn't flinched. She'd protected Evan, had stood up to power that most people only read about in distant news stories, and she'd refused to give in to fear, no matter how many times it knocked on her door. The story of what happened never made it to the evening news in full. The details were too dangerous, the implications too vast. But within certain circles, veterans, whistleblowers, parents who'd risked everything for their children, Sarah's story traveled by word of mouth, gaining its own life. She was invited to speak on forums for veterans, asked to give advice to others who found themselves up against impossible odds. At first, she hesitated, unsure what she could say that wouldn't put her family at risk again. But slowly, the importance of her experience took root, and Sarah began to share. Not the classified details, but the truths that mattered most. She typed her story late at night, sometimes with Evan asleep in the next room, sometimes in the lonely hours when old anxieties crept in. She told of the choices she'd made, the price paid for protecting what was right, and the unexpected ways the world could send help. Sometimes as old friends, sometimes as wild guardians on the edge of the woods. She described the sensation of stepping into danger with eyes open, of refusing to back down even when every instinct screamed to hide. Her words resonated. Messages came in from across the country. Other veterans, single parents, people who had faced their own impossible situations and come through scarred but standing. Some thanked her for her courage, others simply shared their own stories, weaving a tapestry of shared struggle and resilience. It was a kind of community Sarah never expected, but one she grew to treasure. They were strangers, but not alone. Sarah ended her story with a reflection she never imagined she'd write. Sable taught me that sometimes protecting what's right means accepting that life will never go back to the way it was. Some scars remain, and the world is never truly safe. But you keep going anyway. Because sometimes, the cost of doing nothing is even greater. Then she turned her words outward, reaching for the readers on the other side of the screen. What about you? Have you ever had an unexpected guardian? A person, an animal, or even a moment of courage that showed up when you needed it most? Tell your story. Share it here. Maybe it will be the sign someone else needs to keep going, to fight for what matters, to believe that guardians of all shapes and forms still watch the world from the shadows. Life for Sarah and Evan settled into a new rhythm, the kind built on small, precious things. Breakfast in the sunlit kitchen, long walks after school, quiet laughter at the dinner table. The worst of the past was never far behind, but it was no longer the center of their lives. They had survived. They had rebuilt. And in the memory of Sable and all she represented, Sarah found a quiet faith that guardianship was not just about vigilance or strength, but about the courage to start again and the humility to ask for help when you need it. As winter receded and spring crept back into the world, Sarah sometimes sat with Evan beneath the stubborn pine in their front yard, listening to the wind in the branches. She would watch him draw pictures of bobcats and forests, filling page after page with wild, watchful eyes. Sometimes, if she listened carefully, she could almost hear Sable moving through the grass at the edge of the woods, unseen, but always present. In that sense, the story was never truly finished. Guardians might vanish, but their lessons remain, echoing in the choices we make, the people we protect, and the stories we dare to tell. Thank you for following Sarah and Evan's journey. If their story reminded you of your own, if you've ever faced darkness and found an unexpected guardian, I invite you to share in the comments. Your voice matters. You never know who you might inspire.